Polnai Gábor, Life with Agoraphobia. Forward. A lot is written on the internet about various symptoms, often taken from professional books, in relation to this very unpleasant condition. In the classic sense, agoraphobia is the fear of being in confined spaces. It relates to places where it is difficult or impossible to leave, escape, or where it is hard to get help. This is an incredibly general formulation. I believe this is a much more complex and multifaceted problem, about which I would like to speak from my own experience in this book. I will describe parts of my life story related to this issue and my more than 20 years spent with the disease. The book discusses anxiety and panic, which are closely related to this condition, though they need to be distinguished. The main goal of writing this book is to help those who have only seen the surface of the issue to better understand the condition. It is for those who may not have been able to comprehend the feelings and actions of their loved ones suffering from this illness, so they can gain a clearer picture of panic disorder, anxiety, and agoraphobia. Chapter 1: My Story with Agoraphobia Elementary School. After a wonderful childhood, one that I could not have wished for anything better, the story began at the end of the 90s. It's been over 20 years, but I still remember my first panic attack to this day. I was 13 years old. My friends and I were heading to a small, private class party. Since we were in charge of the music, which was still played from a cassette tape recorder at the time, we arrived earlier than the others to set up the tunes to match the mood. Suddenly, before the rest of the class arrived, a very strange feeling took over me. I felt like I was going to faint, I was sweating, turned pale, and an unfamiliar escape urge gripped me. My legs weakened, they were trembling, and I felt like I needed to flee the place. Like a hunted animal, I started running from the school towards home. The usually 3-minute walk felt like hours. Once home, I quickly drank a glass of water and lay down in bed, as this terrible feeling wouldn't go away. Pulling the blanket over my head, I screamed for help. My parents were home but couldn't imagine what had happened. Both they and I at the time thought that my blood pressure had dropped, as this was something that often happened with growing teenagers. The fear and the faint-like sensation didn't go away that day, but I eventually managed to fall asleep and slept through the night. When I woke up, I felt better, so I headed to school. Upon arriving, I immediately felt that strange, tingling fear again, but it wasn't too bad. The lessons began, and I sat down at my desk. Around the third lesson, the same feeling overtook me as it had the previous day. Most of all, I felt the need to escape, and, shamefully, in the middle of class, I grabbed my bag and ran out of the classroom. I didn't stop until I was home. By this time, my parents were already worried, as they thought it was more than just a simple drop in blood pressure. That same day, we went to the pediatrician. Back then, psychological issues were still in their infancy, and the concept of childhood panic disorder, along with its treatment, was almost unknown among general practitioners and pediatricians. Therefore, the pediatrician said, "Maybe you just don't feel like going to school," humorously adding that I had a diagnosis of school disgust. He didn't prescribe any medication or offer any advice and simply sent me back to school. In class, the teacher didn't know how to explain what was happening, and I received looks of contempt and rude remarks from my classmates. At that moment, I felt like something was seriously wrong with me, and I was probably going crazy. From the outside, my body felt foreign to me, my movements were uncoordinated, and I was constantly on the verge of collapsing. I felt like school was the main trigger for my discomfort. I linked the source of the problem to school, and subconsciously, I created the first zone in my life, a place I couldn't enter. I couldn't even go near it anymore. I didn't dare tell my parents about my symptoms at home, and I began avoiding school. I remember sitting on benches, feeling an overwhelming sense of guilt, blaming myself and the school for my condition. I was afraid of what my parents, classmates, and friends would think. I was scared I was going crazy and that I might die. I accumulated many unexcused absences, but eventually, I honestly told my parents that these episodes of discomfort were ongoing and that I hadn't been going to school for weeks. I remember they were understanding and kind despite everything, and they went to speak with my homeroom teacher, who was informed about why I hadn't been attending. At that point, we returned to the pediatrician, who gave me a referral for a full medical examination in Budapest, suspecting that there might be a problem with my heart. My father took me there. The results of the examination were completely negative, everything was fine, and since they suspected a psychological issue, they referred me to a psychiatric clinic in Budapest. I must mention that as a child, this was a huge shock and a breaking point in my life. Upon arriving at the psychiatric clinic, I was met with a horrible sight and feelings, seeing people urinating on the walls, twitching, and shouting. I ran out of the building, feeling unwell, and I didn't want to stay there. My parents began searching for me, but they found me quickly, and we agreed to look for a private doctor because the sight at the clinic had likely affected them as well. That same day, a doctor was able to see me, and after a few minutes of conversation, he prescribed medication and treated me like a lunatic. His initial diagnosis was childhood anxiety. I started taking the medication, but it only made my condition worse. I became even more afraid, terrified of the sudden underwater sensation that came over me from morning to night, and I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't describe it accurately. At that time, the best I could explain it was, I feel like my body doesn't belong to me, which, of course, only worsened the situation, as it could have been a sign of a more serious psychiatric illness. The regular medication and psychiatric checkups didn't bring any results, and I constantly feared when I would have to go back to school. I begged at home, struggling, not wanting to go, wanting to stay home. At that point, my parents and homeroom teacher put their heads together and came up with the idea that, with the principal's approval and a doctor's recommendation, I could be placed in private student status. This was a very reassuring thought for me because I knew that I only needed to go to school for 1 or 2 hours, take smaller exams, and could study at home. I quickly received the medical opinion and the principal's approval, but the downside of this was that I felt completely ostracized. I was often criticized, humiliated, and no one understood why I was in an elite position, not having to attend school. There were times when I was even physically beaten because of this. So, the remaining year and a half of elementary school passed, but luckily, a few friends stuck by me, and they came to visit me while I was studying at home. However, by then, the feeling had become so severe that I couldn't even leave the house unless my parents went with me. I went to school for exams, studied at home, but I still wasn't completely well. My family and I went on trips and to the theater, but these unexplained attacks, which appeared out of nowhere, still struck me in unfamiliar places. Yet, my family always provided a sense of security, and they passed quickly. In the end, I barely finished elementary school as a private student, and the next step came, high school. Strangely enough, I was looking forward to it, and I hoped that I would feel better among new people. After the difficulties of elementary school, I applied to several high schools. With renewed energy, I was happy to have been accepted into a healthcare vocational school in Budapest, which had been a great desire of mine. Then came the summer break, which went very well. My symptoms eased, we went to the beach, took trips, I partied, and the attacks came less frequently. By the end of the break, I was virtually symptom-free. I convinced myself that this mysterious thing inside me was gone and that I had healed on my own. I stopped taking the medication under medical supervision after a few weeks, and I had a wonderful summer behind me. High school and student jobs. High school began, where I met new people, built new relationships, and I was very happy that many of my female classmates liked me, so dating became active for me as well. The first year was wonderful, although my grades didn't reflect that, I felt good. At the end of the year, there was a final party, for which I prepared enthusiastically and looked forward to dancing with my classmates. However, as the party started and we were dancing, that terrible feeling I had experienced a year earlier came back. I had to run away. But this time, it wasn't just a few hundred meters to the safety of home, but 20 kilometers away. I had to take public transportation, like a drunk person who doesn't know where they are, gasping and feeling sick. I tried to get home, but everyone thought I was crazy on the public transport because I was doing completely irrational things, like staring at my own hands, not understanding what was happening to my body. Everything felt foreign, my body, the environment, and everything I had seen daily. Once I got home, the symptoms disappeared instantly, but when I was alone, the panic increased. If my parents went out, I desperately called them every 5 minutes asking when they would be back, and sometimes I tried to prevent them from leaving. Sometimes, I used very dramatic methods, like standing in front of their car and crying, begging them not to leave. It was an incredibly guilt-inducing feeling, which caused many arguments at home, and I could say that I made their lives miserable with my illness. I couldn't understand what was going on or why everything was fine when my parents were at home, but the moment they left, it all started again. Since summer break came, I didn't have to go to school, but I definitely wanted to go to a good doctor who would finally tell me what was wrong with me. Eventually, I got an appointment at the local city psychiatric clinic. A first impression of an unfriendly female psychiatrist was waiting for me. After hearing my story, she diagnosed me with agoraphobia, still in the early stages, and what I was experiencing were panic attacks combined with derealization and depersonalization. Instead of the old medications, she prescribed a strong sedative and an SSI, serotonin-enhancing mood-lifting medication. At first, taking the medication was difficult because of the many side effects. But after a few weeks, I began to feel better. Still, I felt it was hard to leave the house. At that time, I could still travel within the country, but I was afraid to travel alone. I kept returning to the psychiatric clinic for follow-up appointments, and after the fourth or fifth visit, the doctor told me to start doing some student work because work heals. At first, I found it quite ridiculous to think that if I worked at some physical job as a 15-year-old, I would heal, but I looked at the possibilities and, with my parents' help, I started working as a gardener at a beach. The doctor was absolutely right, because after I received my first paycheck, which was far more than my pocket money, I felt successful. I felt gardening was something I was good at, and I thought I should dive deeper into it in the future. But first, I had to finish high school. I started planning to take on student jobs every year and slowly save money for a driver's license by the time I turned 17, which had always been my dream. So, I had ambitions, worked all summer, and although I was still going to the psychiatric clinic, I was mostly symptom-free thanks to the medication. When summer ended and school started again, unfortunately, the awful feeling came back. I had to run away. I repeated what I had done at the end of the previous year's party. I tried to get home, and my first stop was the psychiatric clinic. But the doctor couldn't really tell me anything new. The next day, when I woke up, I didn't feel like going to school, and I didn't have the energy for it, so I stayed home for a week, fearing the agoraphobia would return. When my rest period prescribed by the doctor ended, I realized that I couldn't approach the school anymore, and the same pattern from elementary school returned. I started avoiding school. By now, with a more mature mindset, I realized that I felt fine while working, but not at school. I accumulated so many unexcused absences in the 10th grade that after just a few weeks, I was expelled. Since the mandatory schooling age at the time was 14, there were no consequences, but the desire to work instead of going to school grew stronger. Of course, I had no qualifications, no profession, no high school diploma, but I thought I would work any unskilled job, save money in the coming years, and live my life. Where I worked as a student, miraculously, they hired me permanently full-time for a good salary, and I felt like something new had started. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and at 15, I began stepping into the real life. I would like to mention that many may not be familiar with depersonalization and derealization, so I'll describe how I experienced them. Derealization and depersonalization can occur in two ways, as a primary condition or as a symptom of panic disorder. For those with the primary condition, it manifests as a mild but continuous underwater feeling, almost like living in a dreamlike state. This can be an incredibly uncomfortable sensation for me. It developed alongside panic disorder, specifically as one of the symptoms of a panic attack. Many people with panic disorder would agree that this is the scariest, worst, and most uncontrollable part of a panic attack. It feels like the person is about to faint, and for a few seconds, they feel their limbs weakening, and everything becomes blurry. You need to imagine this pre-fainting state lasting for several minutes. During this time, everything feels foreign, including the environment and even oneself. You are aware that you are in that place, but it feels as if you're about to faint. Unfortunately, this is an extremely dangerous state, but not for health, rather, for surrounding factors. This means that during a panic attack accompanied by derealization, for example, on public transportation or while driving, a person may completely lose control and do almost anything to escape the situation, even running across a busy road or trying to jump out of a moving car, as I did during that time. So, there is no significant health risk, but it's the most terrifying part of the experience, especially if you are in a situation where an accident could happen. Fortunately, I escaped these situations by sheer luck.